We will now begin our third session titled Free Trade or Fair Trade. Dr. Qureshi from Korea University will be moderating the session. Dr. Qureshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving us this opportunity for me to chair this panel of distinguished lawyers and economists on trade and international economic law generally. The topic is free trade or fair trade, a very old theme, a very old question that the international community has been struggling with as long ago as the Opium War. And even indeed, I think there's some resonance even in Hamlet's play, to be or not to be. That is the question, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take arms against a sea of troubles. So the choice between free and fair trade is a discourse that has been taking place for centuries. I will first introduce this panel, and we'll start off with some opening remarks by each of the panelists. Thereafter, I would invite you to make your contributions and introduce your name and affiliation as is customary, and make your comments. So the first panelist here is Professor An Dukgeun, or Dukgeun An, as the case may be. And Professor An is a very distinguished Korean professor of international trade law and policy from Seoul National University. He's a commissioner of the Korea Trade Commission and chair for CPTPP Forum and the TBT Policy Forum. He's also, fortunately for us, I think, president for the International Society of Fair Trade. And he was a former member of the National Economic Advisory Council in Korea. And he's both has a legal as well as a background as an economist. So I'm very envious of him of having both insights in this field. And Professor Fukagawa Yukiko is Deputy Dean and Professor at the School of Political Science and Economics at Waseda University. She is the author of a number of publications, including Economic Development in East Asia recently, and has co-edited a number of other publications focusing on integration issues in Northeast Asia. Formerly, she worked for the Japan External Trade Organization and the Long-Term Credit Bank Research Institute, and has worked in a consultative capacity to the Ministry of Economy and Industry. And her background is economics. Our third panelist is Professor Patrick Messerlin from the Sciences Po Paris in France. And he has a very long, distinguished career in having worked at different institutions, including a close connection with Seoul National University. And he's been advising the World Bank as well as the WTO in different time periods of his profession. And he's, as I understand, he comes to trade from the economic discipline. And finally, but not least, Tami Overby, who is a senior director at McLarty Associates, and she has been for some years before her current position working in Korea. She is on the board of the Korea Society and the International Student Council, as well as the Korea Economic Institute's Advisory Council. And while she was in Korea, she was the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea and the president of the US Korea Business Council. So she brings to us very much a practitioner's dimension to the subject of international trade. You would have seen from the literature that's been provided a set of questions on international trade that essentially are sparked off by the current US administration's approach to international trade. I'm going to invite each of those speakers to kind of talk around that agenda of topics that are sparked off by, essentially, from the current contemporary crisis that the international trading community is faced with. So I will start off with Tami. If you could start us off with Tami, and I'm asking each of the speakers to first very briefly tell us what they mean by free and fair trade, and then to speak from their perspective on this question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. And I'm not the lawyer or the economist on the group. I am the humble business sector representative. The topic of free and fair trade has gotten much press in the United States over the last few years, and I believe has contributed to the election of President Donald Trump. Many people in America have the view that the U.S. has not been treated fairly through our trading relationships. Our president has been very critical of existing free trade agreements, whether that be NAFTA or Chorus, and has worked very hard to renegotiate these agreements. We have seen a dramatic shift in the direction of America's trade policy. And from my perspective, this shift has not been positive. We have moved away from supporting a rules-based architecture and have moved towards a managed economy. This president and his administration are using tariffs as a weapon to encourage other countries. Perhaps encourage is not the right word, maybe force would be a better word, to force other countries back to the negotiating table with us. Now, no one objects to the modernization of NAFTA. The NAFTA agreement was over 20 years old when it was signed. That was pre-internet, so it did need a lot of updating. But I would suggest that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP agreement, of which Canada and Mexico were both parties, had effectively modernized that. But unfortunately, on day 3 of President Trump's administration, with literally no policy review, President Trump withdrew America from the TPP. I believe that history will view that decision as one of the biggest strategic mistakes of the Trump administration. One of the other challenges we are seeing in the U.S. Trade environment is, from my perspective, the misuse of trade statutes. In particular, the National Security Exemption, or Section 232. The Trump administration applied it on steel and aluminum, and our own Secretary of Defense is on record as saying he did not believe the import of steel and aluminum was a national security threat, And he went further to say that he believed applying this tariff against our allies was actually a national security threat. He was worried that the capricious use of these threats against our friends and allies would cause us damage. We now are under the threat of another 232 for autos and auto parts. The Commerce Department has presented their report to the President. The President has 90 days to make a determination. The 90-day clock ends on May 18th. And many people expect that President Trump will move to, well, first of all, that the report has found, although we don't know, but we believe it will find that autos and auto parts are a national security threat. Although, broadly speaking, most people in America don't believe that, and President Trump's own tweet indicated that it was leverage to force other countries to the table, in particular Japan to negotiate a bilateral FTA and the EU to negotiate an FTA. On May 18th, we may have a decision from the President, and many people believe that he is going to move forward and apply those tariffs. If he does that, it will affect the EU for European autos, Japan, and Korea. I find that very unsettling as someone who has followed trade in Asia for 30 years, because from my perspective, America has always focused on rules-based architecture, and now to be moving away towards a managed trade situation, and one where we use tariffs as a weapon. I think we're creating problems that will hurt us later. There are some discussion beginning in the U.S. that perhaps President Trump will delay the decision past May 18th. There's nothing in the Section 232 statute that I'm aware of that allow for a delay, but when I asked someone in the White House what's the justification for the delay, they said it's President Trump, he can do whatever he wants. So I think there's really an expectation that we really don't know what's going to happen, but many people in DC, and I am in that category, that believe President Trump has talked about the import of foreign cars for decades, and that he will impose those sanctions. The result of this change in U.S. approach and strategy on trade, I believe, has significantly damaged U.S. credibility globally. We have also withdrawn from international treaties, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal, and as I mentioned, TPP. It leads me to wonder how countries can enter into future agreements with us when we are so cavalier about withdrawing. I thought it might also be of interest to you to know what President Trump's current trade policies or his trade priorities are. Number one would be the ratification of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, or NAFTA 2. The second priority is resolving the U.S.-China trade war. Third and fourth would be the U.S.-Japan negotiation, and fourth would be the U.S.-EU negotiation. Regarding the USMCA ratification, it's facing headwinds. The ITC report has just been released, so all the statutory requirements have been met. The administration can submit the legislation to Congress for a vote at any time now. But most administrations are very cautious about submitting those documents until they have confidence that they have enough votes to secure passage. And that is far from clear at this point. As you know, the Democrats control the House, and Speaker Pelosi would be the deciding person on when or if the House would vote on USMCA. And I find it hard to imagine the Democrats allowing the vote to happen without some changes to the agreement that will reflect their interests in labor and environment. But those discussions are ongoing. Regarding the U.S.-China trade war, I believe we are coming close to an agreement. The expectation from the colleagues that I talked to are by the end of April or early May, we should have the contours of a deal. They're talking about a document of about 150 pages that does include a very robust enforcement system. There are two big questions remaining that I have. What happens to the existing tariffs? The Chinese would like to see them all removed, whereas President Trump and his administration would like to maintain some. The second large question I have is, what are the enforcement mechanisms? What do they look like? And are they reciprocal? Initially, Ambassador Lighthizer wanted unilateral enforcement option. He wanted the U.S. to be judge, jury, and executioner, to be able to decide whether or not the Chinese were meeting the obligations. The latest press and discussion I'm hearing is that this is now reciprocal. Both sides will have the opportunity to hold the other side accountable. They do have, they've set up some, apparently some very clear processes. If we believe the Chinese are not meeting a particular commitment, there would be meetings at the working level. Those meetings would be elevated a couple of months later, and if we still aren't happy, they will be elevated further to the Lighthizer-Liahe stage.
Thank you.
So I'm optimistic that they will we'll have a solution soon. The U.S. business community is very nervous that that final solution will be heavy on the shopping list, where the Chinese will agree to buy a lot more soybeans, perhaps more Boeing planes, but will be perhaps weaker on the IP side, the forced technology transfer, the subsidies, and the long list of other challenges that the United States has regarding the systemic challenges. Regarding the U.S.-Japan trade agreement, Minister Motegi was in Washington last week. The conversations went well, from what I understand. Minister Motegi will be back this week. Prime Minister Abe will also be there. You may not be aware that Melania's 49th birthday is Friday. Prime Minister Abe will be there to attend her birthday party, and then on Saturday he will play golf with President Trump. Whether an announcement is made about the scope, the final scope of the negotiation, it's yet to be announced. There is some dispute about whether to make a mini deal, a small, narrow agriculture and autos deal, or a broad FTA.
Okay.
I will tell you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to cede my time, sorry.
No, thank you for setting out the scene, the contemporary scene, and the progress that is being made in different areas. So I'll call upon Patrick, please, if you could give your
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, thank you to the Asan Institute to have invited me. It's a very important session for me, and I learned a lot. I will do on 2 points, past and present, and then the future, what to do. Past and present, I talk about free versus fair trade. Free trade does not exist, and fair trade does not exist. Free trade is a purely economic concept of the Ricardo, coming from Ricardo. And in fact, in the economic theory, there are also development which shows that there are always obstacle to free trade. So basically, the same theory which explain how free trade is the optimal issue, explain also how they will never be reached. So we have to live in an imperfect world of vested interest. Fair trade, it's easier. Many people talk to fair trade in the first sentence, and then the second sentence is about the unfair trade practices of the partners, which basically means that fair trade is a kind of polite word for protection. And that's not recent. That's anti-dumping, countervailing duties were really part of this game. So we are living in a world which is in fact liberal trade. And there are white liberal trade or gray liberal trade. There is a wide range of liberal trade. Basically, it is dominated still by the WTO. And let me just say in a few words, the imperfection of the WTO and then the success of the WTO, imperfection, we have never been able to deal with subsidies. I focus on a few of them. Subsidies in agriculture, never be able to deal with it. Subsidies in industry, manufacturing, never be able to impose discipline. And even subsidies on services, never been able to impose subsidies. Nobody knows. We work on cultural industries, the huge amount of subsidies that the big Hollywood studio receive from the states of the United States. So there is a lot of subsidies in the film industry in the US. So the US is one of the senior of this game. And in fact, during the 8 years which have preceded the Obama administration, the Obama administration has used a lot of subsidies, export subsidies, export promotion. So the trend that we see with a big change, drastic change with the Trump administration did not come completely out of the blue. There was a kind of slow preparation. The WTO never really dealt with the state-owned enterprise because basically it was not a big problem before China. I'm coming from France. This is a country where we have a lot of state-owned enterprise, and everybody telling us, good luck, try to make them profitable instead of making them sucking the public treasury. The problem with China is that the size of Chinese economy, the size of the state-owned enterprise, and the link with the state-owned enterprise with the central government, and sometimes the provincial government. So this is really something which makes the difference between the traditional state-owned enterprise, where the system has coped with it very easily, and the current situation. And finally, we never cope at the WTO in a good way from services, which basically represents 70% of the GDP of developed countries. What we did well was tariff on goods. Basically, we eliminate many tariff on goods, industrial goods, not agricultural goods, industrial goods. And I want to say one thing which is important. In 2008, the situation today starts in 2008 with the financial crisis. There was, during a few months, the fear of a trade crisis, where you have piles of ships waiting for order in Singapore and no order at all, no delivery at all. Fortunately, the trade system, the WTO, was functioning well enough to avoid this trade crisis. So we were very good compared to the bankers. And one of these countries which behaved very well at this time was China. China just applied the tariff, where at the bond tariff, according to the WTO. I mean, you have to have the whole history in mind and not only the last year. So we thought that cars, steel, and all this stuff was part of the prehistoric situation. Good success also in dispute settlement. Here we have lawyers, they will talk much better than me on this issue, but basically the system was an acceptable safety valve. And this is precisely these 2 points that President Trump administration is fighting. So the two real success of the 50 years, 60 years are under fire now from the Trump administration. So you can understand why there is a change in terms of scale of the problem between the Obama administration, which started some protection, and the Trump administration, because really the Trump administration is focusing on the core. The idea, in fact, trade policy is always say trade policy is local politics. It's always said that, and it's true. The problem of the current president, and you're American, so you could talk more about that than me, is that the current president is as aggressive internally than externally. So it's not the kind of president that we used to have, which tried to behave on the basis of the welfare for the whole United States. It's a very different kind of presidency, internally and externally. Second point, time is lapsing, the future. US is a little bit stuck, and either President Trump is reelected, or even if he's not reelected, it will not be easier to calm down the dust in Washington, D.C. So what can we do? And I think the theme is a Korean choice, and we should say the choice of every country, the EU, Korea, Japan, waiting for the US to come back. First, about the WTO. The real problem is not really the cut in tariffs, because all of us, the big guys, we have already relatively low tariff. The people who are really hurt are the least developing countries, because they did not use the previous GATT rounds or WTO rounds to really lower their tariffs. So this is really the people who pay the price of the chaos today. Now, this is not the same thing for the dispute settlement. And here I'm talking about the views of Professor Anne. I think we can do something. Nobody, let's say there is a dispute between the EU and Japan, and the EU and Japan decide, in fact, to take 3 panelists, use the WTO rules, the WTO procedures, and the system is working like this. The US cannot do anything if he's not party of this fight. The only thing he can do is launch a complaint at the WTO, but at this time the WTO could not work because there will be no enough member panel of the jury. So I think we have to continue to use the WTO procedures among the willing, if I may say, and not to stop, not to accept the whole blockage. And then the US sooner or later will come back. Preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements. In fact, the EU has been a huge beneficiary of the Trump administration, because basically we have been able to sign a free trade agreement with Japan thanks to the withdrawal of the US from the TPP, because then all the possibility, especially in agriculture, to go to Japan were really increased by the absence of the US. So, courtesy of President Trump, we are in good shape. The problem is that there is Korea EU, Japan EU, and they are not necessarily compatible. And for example, Japanese firms have invested in Korea because there was a Korea EU, and now what they do? They go back to Japan because there is a EU-Japan free trade agreement. So for the business, all these agreements are a little bit chaotic and create serious problem. So we have to work hard on a network of preferential trade agreements. And I think the starting point will be EU, Korea, Japan, Australia. Australia, we are working with on Australia, EU-Australia free trade agreement. There is a Korea Australia free trade agreement, and there is the same thing with the Japan. So, and I look at some of the provisions, they are relatively easily compatible. So we could start to create a network of compatible and consistent trade agreements, free trade agreement. The main point also for this free trade agreement is to talk about services. And here I want to mention something which has been said at the first session this morning. Trade policy is a domestic policy. You make it bigger if you make trade policy as an international policy in the broad speaking. Why? Because in fact, let's say in services, what you need is good regulations. And good regulations cannot be handled by the WTO. Good regulations are handled by the domestic institutions. It's a good health safety institution, agency. It's a good norms all this stuff are essentially domestic, and then we can expand them to the FTA. We have this long chapter, or I don't know chapter, but many page on the EU-Japan cooperation on norms. So I think that's really would be the one point very crucial to say. I don't want to say one word on Korea because I will be really outrageous. But I think Korea has, just to say one thing which really is close to my heart since a long time, Korea has one additional constraint than us, the EU or the US. This is how to manage the progressive economic integration of North Korea in the regional agreements. And South Korea, I use the term South Korea to be clear, South Korea have to do some reforms because of that. And we don't have to do the same thing. In fact, we did a little bit when we integrated the Central European countries at the same time. I just stop here with one concluding point. Make trade a leverage is really a bad attitude. I mean, it doesn't work well. This country is the best example. Korea-US film agreement in the film industry. The US basically was using, you know this one? The US basically was using a 301 threat, 301 threat. They get open access to Korea. The people in Hollywood say, well, now the Korean market is ours. 10 years later, the Korean market was completely Korean. So in fact, if the domestic industry is capable to react, you think that opening a market is good for your industry, but it can be good for the domestic industry. I stop here.
Thank you very much for that, and I will call upon Professor Fukagawa to...
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for Asan Plenum for inviting me to such a, always intellectually stimulating place. And my couple of comments on present situation now is that, in fact, I'm from Japan, and we are going to host the G20 this year, and we've been discussing intensively how we can contribute something positively towards the WTO reforms and other trade regime. And in that sense, Japan is quite a unique in positions because almost a quarter of century passed since the Japan saw the total collapse of the bubbles. But in Europe and in the US, it's only 10 years. So in our sense, political economic cycle is, in some sense, advanced in Japan. And we did experience the whole chaotic situations. And then we came back to the basic principle, after all, free trade is good for everybody. So that's why Japan has been promoting TPP and relatively large, big FTA pact with the EU and many others recently. But nevertheless, I think still we are facing in a very serious situations in maintaining the trade regime. First, because everybody is probably experiencing a globalizing backlash, and there's enormous income gap, but also as an asset gap, because many economies are seeing the enormous picking up of the asset market, and also the malfunctioning of the redistribution system, like for example, education, health, environment, and those things are all has become a kind of business. So the opportunities for the poorer people can never be quite equal if it goes in this way. And that's why social cohesion has got so much weakened, especially in the mature economies taking in the immigrants. And another issue is there seems to be quite a returning of the desire for sovereignty. So now Mr. Trump has been advocating America first, but we cannot criticize it because our Abenomics is quite similar in making, let's make our country great again. And I think Macron's France seems to be quite similar. So there is enormous desire for sovereignty, even in mature economies, which has been committed to the globalizations, even including UK, those who seems to be positive about the Brexit well, seems to be quite pushed by the ideas we got to be independent from EU committee. So this is our situations. And another thing is there's a sharp conflict between the younger generation who experience the positive side as well as the negative side, but sometimes more the positive side of the globalizations like SMS and the all connected world, versus older generation who still based on the ideas on the 20th century kind of structures. And in terms of emerging countries and rising big, especially countries like Brazil, India, China, of course, has their versions of sovereignty issues, because now our time has come. So let's make the global order, including ourselves, and stop the mature economies dominated world. So this is a kind of difficult situations. And the third thing is, I think this is the most important thing. So we've been talking about the tariff or non-tariff or the liberalizations of service, etc., just based on the sovereignties and the national border. But nowadays, our innovations is wholly driven by digital technologies. And in terms of digital technologies, there's it should be very difficult to pack the whole environment into the national border in a traditional sense. So that's why there's an enormous leapfrogging by China. So we won't be very much surprised if China has a latest and most sophisticated technologies in artificial intelligence or big data controls or whatever. So we have to find some rational rules that China can be interested in, and China can be the responsible players in decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And Professor Han?
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. Free trade, fair trade, both entail often huge confusion. Fair trade first. Fair trade, actually in trade area, it means managed trade. So often we actually try to avoid this terminology. Now the managed trade seems to be very prevalent. Free trade, no tariff, no obstacle for trade, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't require any rules or norms. Actually, free trade demands very rigorous trade system, institution, and rules to support free trade. In that sense, now when the US government tries to propose fair trade, actually it is causing big trouble to the world trading system. When Chinese government claim that they are now champion of free trade, actually it is not the correct statement, because they are not complying with all those trade rules. Now, US and China, two major causal elements for this trade problem in the world, are trying to negotiate on some kind of settlement to resolve the current situation. Will it work? Actually, when we have US-China settlement, then probably the only player, I'm not sure whether the US will actually happy with the final outcome in the longer term, but at least phenomenally, US will be the beneficiary of this arrangement. But the victim is practically all other countries, especially East Asian countries. In East Asia, apart from the NAFTA bloc, East Asian economies shows remarkable regional value chain established in recent years. But when we have US-China settlement arrangement, that means in the world trading system, we will have unprecedented scale of managed trade system to begin. And that will cause huge distortion and disturbance for regional economies. And then in the WTO side, to promote more free trade, now they try to strengthen or at least modify some rules under the name of WTO reform. In the WTO reform, and what kind of rule we need to promote more free trade. Here we have a huge disagreement between US versus China, developed country versus developing country. And now we talk about the digital trade rule, state-owned enterprise rule, new subsidy rule. We don't know whether the talks will have any progress based on our experience so far with the Doha negotiations. Clearly now, we are seeing the major economic blocs arranged among major economies, US, EU, Japan. Incidentally, the representatives are here. The EU, Japan just finished FTA, and then US is pushing Japan and EU to have individual FTAs, probably under the USMCA template. Whether USMCA and when it can be ratified, as Tami mentions, we have some difficult challenge in the coming years, but it seems obvious that now US completely changed the paradigm for world trade rule. Basically, the example is USMCA. Korea, we once boasted our accomplishment. We thought that we are the center of FTA networks. We are among very few countries to have FTA with the US, EU, and China with ASEAN. So we thought that we are the core of these FTA networks and at the linchpin of these global trading systems. Now, US tried to basically move its center for whole economic integrations, practically including only EU and NAFTA bloc, plus Japan. So right after we completed US-Korea FTA renegotiations, in some sense we were shocked. Right after that, US government announced the USMCA, and the text shows dramatically different trade regime. And Korea didn't even have any request to consider or accept those new model for global trade, the rules. So is it the approval of our previous economic relationship, or Korea is now alienated from new trade order rebuilt by the Trump administrations? So what is Korea's choice? It's very difficult. Of course, in theory, we should somehow link with this new global trade order. But how come? Maybe practically speaking, CPTPP appears to be the only hope or opportunity to have the linkage with this new global trade order. But the political situation between the Korea and Japan makes this last opportunity more challenging and difficult now. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, the panelists have come up with, I think, somewhat different takes on what the issues are and indeed what we mean by fair trade. One expression of what is happening, if I can summarize Tami's point of view, is that the current situation is one to be contrasted between the rule of law and a system that is managed outside the context of the rule of law. And Patrick's view, as I understand, of fair trade is that it is essentially about protectionism. And Professor An's view, equation of fair trade with managed trade as well. Professor Fukagawa has mentioned, however, certain aspects of trade that are grounded in popular expectations, as well as so the idea of social cohesion and the social aspects to international trade. So I think the agenda that we have been given today really there are two different aspects to that set of issues, namely what is the nature of free trade that we should engage in, and second, how should we accommodate that developing and different perspectives on fair trade in terms of a system of decision-making in the international context in terms of rule of law. So the question, I guess, is as much about the dichotomy between rule of law and management of the international economy as about the rule of law and the way in which the rule of law should respond to allowing and accommodating, both at the domestic level and at the international level, different and rising expectations of what the concept of fair trade means to everyone. I'd like to ask just perhaps 3 questions before I open up the panel discussion. And one is that my sense of the Trump administration's vision of or concept of fairness is centers around the idea of asymmetry or symmetry in balance of trade deficits. And so this seems to be a new expectation in the context of international trade as I understand it. And I'm wondering what the panelists think about how this expectation sits with the idea of the theory of comparative advantage that we all understand the international trading system to be set against, and also the notion of reciprocity in the WTO, how those two concepts sit and are located in terms of this idea of trade balance between different partners, trading partners. The other question, which I think some speakers have touched upon, but the talk about further integration in international trade, further negotiations in free trade agreements, further models of arrangements, preferential trade arrangements, should, I think, now be set against the background of Brexit and the issues that Brexit has raised. And one, of course, is that how one should accommodate populist expectations with reference to any form of integration arrangements that a country is engaging in. And another is that, well, look, we can all get it wrong, and if we, just in case we can all get it wrong, are we setting up the mechanisms there that facilitate an exit strategy, just in case all of it doesn't fall through in the future? Well, those are my two questions for the present, and you can take them after we have received the questions and comments from the audience. So I open up the floor now, and please raise your hand and if you wish to make comments or ask questions. Yes, please. So if you can introduce yourself.
Andrew Salmon from Asia Times. We've seen these black swans in the Anglosphere in recent years, the Brexit and the advent of the Trump administration, which, as you noted, is reversing much previous conventional wisdom about trade. Do you think these two events are just going to be blips in an otherwise upward trend, or is this something that we're stuck with for the foreseeable future? Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll collect questions Yes, the gentleman there.
So, Troy Sanger with the Korea Economic Institute. Tami, you talked about how at one point that some of the things that the Trump administration is doing might come back to haunt the United States later. I want to maybe have you sort of unspooled this a little bit, because you talked about how Trump has sort of been clear that the 232 is really more about leverage than it is about actual rules-based procedures. So I guess there's two outcomes here. One is that at some point in a post-Trump order, we move back to more of a rules-based administration, rules-based order, and then it would seem as though the United States would be open to essentially litigating this out and losing all of these cases and hence be in a worse position. The other option is that we end up unspooling the rules-based order, which in the long run also seems to be bad for the United States. I mean, is that sort of where you're going? If you could maybe expand upon this some. Thanks.
Thank you. Please.
Sandy Vershbow, also for Tami, how can the abuse of the 232 be addressed? Is the Congress capable of taking action on this? Is it a WTO issue, or what? Or is the administration sort of without any checks and balances on this issue?
Okay, we'll speak about those questions, and then we can come back again. Tami, you had two questions addressed to you.
If you don't mind, I'll answer them in reverse order. Ambassador Vershbow, the abuse of 232, I think the question, does the U.S. Congress have courage to address that? We have yet to see it, although we are beginning to see some evidence, perhaps led by Republican Senator Grassley, a movement to bring back some of that power to Congress. I certainly hope and pray that we see a check and balance, because I firmly believe in moving to Troy's question also about the misuse of the 232, the national security exemption. I believe that we are teaching other nations, we're being a very bad example for them, and I believe we're going to see other nations, perhaps China, perhaps India or Brazil, use that national security exemption, misuse it in a similar way, and that's going to be bad for the U.S., but also the global rules-based system. I hope that the U.S. In the next administration moves back to the rules-based system, but the jury's still out, and I'm not yet queen of the world, so we'll have to see how it plays out.
Okay. Dr. Patrick, do you have any?
Maybe on Brexit. I think what is happening in the UK is really a lesson for all the Europeans, and of course the British are giving us a big hand. Basically, I really believe that they have voted because they were completely misinformed by the campaign between Remain and Leave. I remember we were in Hong Kong the day of the referendum, and there was Mr. Farage. Farage is one of the leaders of the Brexiters, and he was interviewed by the BBC, and he was promising during the campaign that the UK will find again 300 billion of euros for the health, and during the campaign he was saying that will solve the health problem, and the health problem is health institutions are in a very difficult situation in UK as in the rest in Europe. And when he was asked by the BBC journalist, so we go back to we get back the 300 billions, and he said, oh, no, not maybe later. I have never seen an interviewer, a journalist, so angry after a politician. Because he said, you were lying. She was saying that, it was the morning after you were completely lying, and that's true. That was really the case. Now, Brexit, since then, I'm always believed that the UK will never leave. That's my bet. Since 3 years, it seems that maybe it looks less crazy today that he was looking, because it's clear that they have so much to lose that sooner or later, you don't need everybody to become a Remainer. You need basically 2% of the population shifting sides. And just realizing how they have been fooled by a few people. And we have the same in France. And I don't want to say that the British politicians are worse than the French politicians, not at all. Now, one thing which is a kind of answer to you is that the British cows for living, and everybody in Europe, Western Europe, everybody was seeing that the British are practically well governed, the government is really well in charge, you know, the machinery is well oiled, blah, blah, blah. This collapse, I can tell you that in France, the far-right party is much more careful about leaving the EU, because they understand now how it will be costly to do so. So they have really turned down all the anti-EU, paradoxically. So we need to give a big thank you note to Boris Johnson and all the others. It's very difficult for the British, I understand. But you know, they see all the Asian investment leaving, the Japanese. I cannot remember which company. And so they see the jobs leaving with the investments. So that makes them thinking twice.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Fukagawa, do you have?
Probably I'm interested in talking about the public goods of free trade regime like WTO and importance of multilateral kind of pact, especially promoted by the US so far. We're having intensive discussions, US, EU, and other people, but we are getting smaller, and we are almost half into the leagues of rest of others. And I really wonder how if the WTO collapse and how the rest of others will be very much hurt by the loss of the public goods. So the first thing that we may be able to do is to persuade constantly the US to realize how important the public goods, how you should stay inside the WTO reforms, etc. And that's one best scenario. So we decided to ratify the TPP-11 because we wish the US to remain in our league in the future, not within a time of Trump administration, but probably we should put some life-keeping device on it. So that was the reason. So that's a positive scenario A. And if the far pessimistic scenario B, we have to be totally prepared for the world without a WTO functioning regime. So maybe EU continues to remain in the EU bloc. After all, you are rich enough to do it. And China remains in their own empire as they based on their own rules. And the US remains as a US. So what will happen to the rest of others? So our strategy is to shape up the TPP-11 so that TPP-11 can be combined with the US bloc probably in the future. And by doing that, we are desperately trying to engage China because, well, as in Korea, our very important supply chains just divided into both China and US as a big market. So that's probably our strategy. So one thing, but at least we have to negotiate with China is there is a enormous asymmetric relations between China and the rest of others. And for example, Chinese companies, like Chinese versions of Uber, like Didi, is operating in Japan, and they are sending their whole information to China every day. But the Japanese companies are totally banned to move their data, market data, out of China. So that situation is yours is ours, but ours is ours. Then the question is how we are going to compete with those people. So we are trying to convince Chinese, saying that the common rules is going to benefit you in the end if you're serious about making the global player?
Thank you. Professor Ahn?
Your first question was not addressed, so let me make a brief comment on trade balance as a new indicator for trade relationship. In that sense, probably it is very interesting to see what the U.S.-China agreement to look like. Especially they try to include enforcement system there. Again, as I mentioned, this is unprecedented scale of managed trade systems. If they codify any kind of element to make a trade retaliation based on this trade balance indicator, that will be very interesting seed to bring the new idea into our conventional wisdom of international trade relationship. Theoretically speaking, there is no way to have reciprocity or this kind of trade balance style element to be considered as a principle or factor for trade relationship. But this time is quite interesting. During the 1980s, there are numerous VR arrangements between US and Japan. And then after that, US government actually had to retaliate against Japan, claiming that the Japanese government didn't comply with their promise. But there was no codified arrangement based on this trade balance kind of stuff. So this time, what will happen is quite interesting in that sense. Very briefly about Ambassador Bushbaugh's issue 232. Actually, a few days ago, WTO issued quite interesting panel report for Russia-Ukraine dispute. In that, for the first time in GATT WTO history, the WTO panel actually made a ruling about how to interpret national security exception, GATT Article 21. That is now critically important for justification of the US Section 232 measure. My impression is if WTO somehow follow the ruling in that case, the current Trump administration Section 232 may not be justifiable in the WTO system. Problem is, probably legally speaking or policy-wise, that sounds much more reasonable or rational. But the problem is, under the current political environment, that decision raises very, very dangerous issue for the status of the WTO systems. As the Lighthizer repeatedly emphasized, that can give the good pretext or excuse for the US government to take the very dramatic actions against the WTO.
Thank you. But I was, there is another point to the question about the expectation of trade deficit, and that is that the current WTO system does provide for a balance in the sense that it provides for a balance of opportunities, not actual trade. So built in the system is the notion of that somewhat reflects this idea of a balance of trade. Thank you. So any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
June Park from George Mason University, Korea. I have a question on WTO reform with regard to how, if ever, at the end of the year, the appellate body is frozen, there's no breakthrough of any sort, how the WTO system would sustain itself with regard to the rulings that were recently given out. So, for example, on South Korea's winning on the Fukushima agricultural goods, or the US-EU win of the market economy status, non-market economy status of China.
Okay. Any other? Yep.
Han from Korea. I just would like to ask Professor Fukagawa and Tami. Let's assume that Japan is now joining TPP and accepted TPP. So let's assume that Japanese economy is more receptive and accommodating toward, say, free and open trade. And U.S., because you are out of that TPP, which had been negotiated, so let's assume that you are a little bit more fair trade and more protected economy. Then I would like to ask both of you, what factor is most important in making a particular economy more receptive about this free trade? Is it a leader or policymaker or the actual understanding of the general public about the merits of globalization and free and open trade? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we can respond to those questions first. Tami, if you want to.
I'm happy to begin. I think you started your question, Ambassador Han, by saying, let's assume that Japan is more open and the U.S. is more protective. I think that's an accurate portrayal. Today, the U.S. is more protectionistic and Japan is more open. And I want to thank all my friends in Japan for the great leadership they showed to keep the high standard comprehensive rules of TPP going. Many people in the U.S. predicted that TPP would die when the U.S. withdrew. Those people, I'm happy to say, were wrong. I think you asked a fascinating question, and one that I've given a great deal of thought to, and I believe the last part of your question, the actual understanding of the public, I think is where America has failed. You were instrumental in selling the Chorus FTA to America. You traveled all across America for maybe 2 years, talking to editorial boards, meeting small and local chambers. I think that broad work needs to be done all across America and constantly. One of the things people say is a crisis, in fact, you said it to me after the IMF crisis, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. I am encouraging my business leader friends that they need to be telling the benefits of trade story now. So from my perspective, that's the answer.
Thank you.
I think we are almost 3 laps behind in terms of globalization. We just pick up the low-hanging fruits in whole globalization. So that's one thing. And if we have to catch up, and that's one thing. But the other thing is, in a lot so-called last 2 decades, we finally succeeded in making consensus, outside pressure work on us. So we have to reform our economy constantly, but without any market pressure, vested interest groups are so established in Japan, so deregulations is very difficult to do, and FDI, Japan's accumulations of FDI stock is very poor, even minor than the North Korea probably. So we've got to do something on it, so that's a strategic purpose of opening up an outside pressure. And the second thing is, frankly speaking, is now we are under the full employment. Everybody has a job, even though the pace of the wage hike is painfully slow, but still people are very satisfied. And Japan is the only country where the younger generation shows more satisfaction than the older generation. So if you ask, are you happy with your present life? Amazingly, now still more than 70% of whole households say yes. And it's, well, most surprisingly, younger generations in their 20s, they say more than 80% or so. We are happy now. So maybe we just ended up in such a very small ambition, satisfaction, unlike Korea. But still, that's our realities. And also, some of the market opening and reform effort has already seen some kind of fruits. So now we are welcoming more than 40 million of sightseeing people from abroad. And we just regulated enormous things in the retailing and the accommodation businesses, etc. And people just believed in, it looks something good than just doing nothing during the whole 2 decades. So let's do something positive. So the atmosphere got something positive response, and that's why. And I think we are very positive about the prospect of the Europe and America will coming back to the basic ideas, open and free trade policies. Well, maybe it could be shortened. Japan lost 2 decades, but maybe not than another decade, but 5 years or something. So that's our hope.
Okay, thank you. Professor Han, WTO question.
The appellate body, simply speaking, there is no hope now. There have been many proposals, but nothing seems to be actually reasonably working. So I will not be very surprised, even though this December, whole WTO member countries were panicked with the suspended appellate body system. But in that sense, probably next year, June, we have a ministerial conference in Kazakhstan. Probably there, we may have another breakthrough. If Japan, EU, United States came up with a new proposal about how to reform the WTO, and that is accepted by the WTO membership, and plurilateral digital trade, kind of thing. So we probably should prepare the worst scenario of the temporary suspension of the WTO system. That's my personal thought. Actually, the gentleman here raised a very important question, but it was not addressed. The Brexit and many other things shows how now countries suffer from the huge income disparity problem, actually, in many countries. And in that sense, I think it is very important to see what kind of agreement will be arranged between US and China this time. So far, fortunately, this huge trade disturbance has been kind of maintained as a bilateral trade problem. But now if we have huge scale managed trade system is announced, then it will cause enormous collateral damage to East Asian the regional value chains and even the global economies. Then many other countries will try to react to that. Then we don't know how it will actually open the Pandora's box for many other countries' domino reaction. So I think what we are waiting between US and China agreement, I personally think it's not a happiness. It's actually the news for opening the Pandora's box.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, questions? I'm just wondering if we are not being too skeptical about the U.S. approach to what international trade, and at one level, at face value, one might just take it as an effort, albeit the modus operandi of that effort may be questionable, of bringing reform to international trade and of developing a concept of fair trade that perhaps some might argue was long overdue and that needs to be further configured in the international trading system. And at the same time, the question about the WTO and its very existence, it will continue, albeit debilitated, and even its dispute settlement system will be there, albeit partially there. In a sense, it is functioning, despite the fact of the ominous paralysis of the appellate body currently. So those are 2 points. I guess now in the time that we have, the one question that is set for this panel, and that is that what are Korea's choices? Free trade or fair trade, whatever that means. And perhaps we can just bring to bear our American, European, and Japanese experiences to this question. After all, we are in Seoul, and we owe it to the Korean community that we reflect upon this question. What are the choices for Korea? So, Tami, please.
Well, my hope and wish for Korea's choice is that they would seriously consider joining CPTPP or the TPP-11 because Korea already has many FTAs with the current TPP members except Mexico and Japan. And I think were Korea to join this important regional trade body, it would help provide additional weight that might, at an appropriate time, attract the United States.
Patrick?
Well, absolutely same wish. But again, when we talk about the difficulties of the people, most of the difficulties of the people are caused by domestic policies. So it's not because you reform the WTO that you reform the domestic policies. And in fact, this is also the impression that the people have. Everything depends from the WTO, and they don't see how much it depends from their domestic government. That this is the rebellion today, because in fact, they ask the domestic government to deliver something. So it's true for Korea, it's true for Europe, it's true for Japan, it's true for everybody.
Okay, thank you.
As Korean experts, of course, I wish Korea to come back to come to a CPTPP league, but at this moment, frankly, it should be very difficult in terms of the political frictions. But other things, we can cooperate in many things. For instance, the most urgent things for the rest of Asia now is to agree the RCEP, including China, India. And we can maybe able to, we'll be able to cooperate to wrap up the RCEP as soon as possible, because if U.S. continues Japan-U.S. FTA and they try to bring in the similar clause with the against Canada and Mexico, saying that if you are to negotiate with the non-market economy, you have to report us or something. So that should be a constraint against for Japan to negotiate with China. So RCEP has been in the process for many, many years, so we have to wind up. So luckily, India and the Indonesian elections is over. So this might be a good timing and be a good opportunities to cooperate with Korea. And the other thing is there is a trend of open plurilateral pact. Thanks to plurilateral pact like IT agreement, even Japan and Korea's the IT-related tariff is zero. And thanks to EGA government procurement agreement, there can be a common foundations between Japan and Korea. So strategic use of plurilateral pact might be a kind of options in the against the political situation now.
Well, for Korea, it's obvious. Actually, the president of this Asan Institute, Ham Jae-bong, is writing 5-book series on the title of The Making of Korean. He tried to basically review the modern Korean history and try to explain how the Korean society has been established this way. Very interestingly, his conclusion is, if Korea, when we are flexible and open to the global standard, global philosophy, Korea flourished. Otherwise, we collapsed. So actually, after finishing 3 books and then waiting to complete the 2 more books, and his clear conclusion is, let's be flexible and open to the global standard. That is his conclusion. I completely agree with that. Right? Based on our modern history, that is our lesson from the history, now we are struggling how to make it happen this time because of the complicated political dynamics.
So I think there is a prior question, perhaps to the question, what are Korea's choices? Is namely that is this the right time to make any choices because the world is undergoing a fair degree of uncertainty. And so you've, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard two different perspectives, I think, here. One is the push for more regional integration and creation of greater blocks in the system, and also the view that multilateralism is absolutely necessary for even trade blocks. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists and your patience. Thank you. Bye-bye.